Microphone working okay? Yes? No?
Not really.
No? It's on? Ah.
You hear it in the booth back there? Yeah?
Yeah? Oh, how's that? Yeah? Okay, great, thank you. Hello everybody, thank you very much for having me. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here at Nina's invitation. As she said, it's been a very long conversation that we've been having remotely until very recently. And I'm delighted to speak with you all today on behalf of Forensic Architecture, the organisation of which I'm one of the assistant directors. Now, our team brings together disciplines including not only investigative reporting, which is my background in digital storytelling, but also architecture, art, law, software development, creative computing, academia, activism, and many more. The subjects of our research are human rights violations and violence around the world, and our techniques are always rooted in open source investigation, video and image analysis, 3D reconstruction, time-based animation, other image analytic practices that grew out of the open source revolution, which we'll talk about shortly, and also imported digital research methodologies such as fluid dynamic simulation, which you see here, which again we'll touch on later on.
So the sound is a little bit low.
Is it? Is there something we can... Guys in the booth? Yeah.
It's on, okay.
It's definitely on.
The only other option is to use the actual microphone.
Oh.
And that's what the audience was saying, so.
Sorry.
Is there a way to...
Better to solve it now. Maybe I could just stand up and project a bit more. Sorry, it felt quite comfortable down there.
Or use this. Is that too annoying to talk? Yeah, that's annoying. No, let's not do that.
Hello. Aha. So when I press mute on there, I should have connected that to... Yeah, okay.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Wow, listen to that.
Okay, so today we are around 25 people. There you can see some of my colleagues in a room in the University of London at Goldsmiths College. We also have a sister agency in Berlin, which is around 8 people, and actually a number of outposts popping up all around the world in Paris, Athens, Ramallah, Bogota, Mexico City. We are really in the process of turning this agency, this individual research organization, into a field of forensic architecture. So we are largely not journalists, as I say, though that is my background. It's probably more accurate to say that we're investigators for hire on behalf of civil society. So we investigate police, militaries, states, intelligence agencies. We never work for them, we always work for and on behalf and with the people that have suffered violence and human rights violations and dispossession at their hands. And since 2011, we've published nearly 100 investigations. I want to talk in detail about, I think, 3 or 4 of them today. And I'll just give you a little kind of map of what some of these projects look like. So you see here a scene from our work on the execution of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian-American journalist. This is work which is now with the International Criminal Court. As we'll talk about, we are always keen to orient our work toward the towards international accountability efforts. We also, a couple of years ago, worked with the Colombian Truth Commission to investigate, among other things, disappearances following the 1985 Palace of Justice siege. This is the Palace of Justice that you see modeled here, and we began working actually with archive imagery, one of the first times that we've conducted human rights investigations using such archival material. And a quick nod to the first investigation that I ever worked on with forensic architecture, where here we're in Cameroon inside a military base, and you're looking at the social media photographs of a US military contractor back in the glory days of Facebook, when people would upload material very freely and enthusiastically with very little regard to privacy settings. The first investigation that I conducted with the agency was to used these photographs shared by a US military contractor to evidence the relation in location between US and foreign personnel. We know that US Navy SEALs were on this base, and to be able to put that in spatial relation with sites that we knew that their Cameroonian partners were torturing and indeed killing civilians on this base. So he's really the guy that I owe most of my professional career to. It's a salutary lesson in making sure you're careful about what you post online. Now, at the time of our founding in sort of early 2010s, 2011, 2012, we emerged out of a research project at the Center for Research Architecture. We were kind of on the threshold of a new era. That new era was defined by the growth into ubiquity of smartphones, of mass instant video documentation and communication, what we called the social web, and the rapid distribution of media across the internet. Now, these changes very quickly turned the world into the kind of vast digital sensorium that we know today, ushered in what many of us call the open source revolution, which is characterized by unprecedented access to digital information and new means for civil society to investigate with and through that information. And at the same time, geopolitical conditions in the early 2010s, beginning, let's say one place we might begin would be with the beginnings of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, created a wave of political unrest which was itself propagated and motivated and driven and articulated by that social web and that mass video documentation and distribution online. Much of which, of course, culminated in the very grim horror of the Syrian civil war. Here you see images from 2018, a chemical weapons attack by the Assad regime that became a locus for conspiracy theories. This was in a suburb of Damascus called Douma in 2018. And it was really in Syria that we, that is the kind of young as it was then open source investigations community, but really the whole world, came to understand how the social and technological changes defined by the prevalence and the ubiquity of the smartphone would really impact how we understood the world. What we saw was that even as conflict and human rights violations became very heavily mediatized, and we may naively and intuitively have hoped that that the sort of fixity of the captured image would bring certainty and maybe offer clarity, we saw that exactly the opposite happened, that mediatization and distribution in fact transpired to make what had happened in scenes of human rights violations such as this less clear rather than more, and far more disputed than less. And so in that context, in those early years, forensic architecture developed as a set of technical tools, theoretical tools for unpacking mediatized and disputed events, and for accessing the truth which often existed within, behind, and between those images. The new possibilities for that practice had some quite impactful and controversial successes. What you're seeing here is images from Russian news channels where they are gloating about their identification of a chemical weapons attack by the Syrian rebels against their own fighters and against the Syrian civilians that they sought to protect. And of course, in this investigation, we were able to use that news footage captured by Russian reporters precisely to disprove the claims that they were making. And it was exactly that inversion of media, an inversion of power, and indeed those two things side by side that came to define the open source revolution in its early years. Because in that way a certain arms race began in this new information space. Individual cases like Douma were really only symptomatic of the emergence of a kind of radically horizontal, multipolar, very chaotic ecosystem of information distribution, one which really exploded all our traditional notions of truth and fact. And I suppose looking back, we all realize now, and we kind of understood fairly quickly, that it was actors on the new populist right who understood the sort of tunes that we were dancing to more quickly than others, and in many respects we all live in the world that their ascendancy created. Is the kind of actors that our director has previously called the insurgents against truth. In fact, it's long been true that conflict and that in conflict, let's say, human rights violations are, and violence is not only committed against bodies and against urban fabrics, but violence is also committed against truth. And violence is also committed against the very possibility of understanding the physical, the kinetic violence. And it's true to say that the changes that were inspired by the open source revolution, the changes that indeed instigated that revolution, have supercharged and augmented states' capacities to perform this twofold attack on bodies and evidence. And I think we see this nowhere more vividly today than in the genocide being perpetrated in Gaza, where we see that those attacks, on systematic attacks on hospitals, on basic infrastructure, on bakeries, on all quarters of civilian life, with tremendous, as we know, tremendous scales of civilian loss of life. We see that those documented and unjustifiable attacks are also being accompanied by attacks on the very possibility of evidence, by a double attack being perpetrated by politicians themselves and by the fraudulent statements being made by the Israeli military and others. But these same principles, or unprinciples, these really leak and echo out from the front lines of geopolitics into our everyday discourse, into contemporary life and social affairs and domestic affairs, including, as we shall later see, here in Portland and here in Oregon and Portland's owned police bureau. And in this climate, faced with this utter disregard for what is the case, it has become vital for civil society and organizations such as ourselves, those who remain committed to the values of human rights and fundamental honesty, I suppose you'd say, in the conduct of political action, to articulate concepts of truth-making and truth that succeed where previous concepts were losing the battle. And in that spirit, I'm delighted to be here on the occasion of the first exhibition of forensic architecture's works in Oregon, as Nina has mentioned, at the exhibition Policing Justice at Portland's Institute for Contemporary Arts. And I want to share a couple of cases with you today towards that exhibition to chart a little of forensic architecture's evolution and to reflect on how our latest investigation into the 2022 murder of June Knightley sits within that evolution and that growth. Because the technological and social circumstances which have driven this decentralization of truth, which have in many respects created both the problem that forensic architecture is seeking to solve and the means by which we will solve it, if ever we will, they actually carry a huge amount of promise. They carry a challenge too, and today forensic architecture is not only seeking to develop tools to read images and the spaces between them, but also to experiment with and to propose new models for collectively and collaboratively constructing truth and using cultural institutions particularly to build publics and to build audiences around those truths. And indeed to build coalitions of belief and action of people and institutions around that exercise of truth production, which in so many cases, and Policing Justice is no exception to that, seeks to ground these new modes of truth production in a greater recognition of colonial history, of structural violence, of institutional racism and blindness, toward ultimately a richer articulation of our shared truth claims. So I want to begin in southern Israel, in the northern Negev desert in 2018. I'm going to show you footage here from a nighttime raid conducted by the Israeli police against a Bedouin village in... Oh, that's interesting. Excuse me, that's the wrong clip. Okay, sorry, excuse me, that's rather frustrating. I'm going to have to describe it for you. So we're going to look at an incident which unfolded in the context of a nighttime raid on the village of al-Hiran on the 17th, overnight into the 18th of January 2017. At the time, this raid was a part of a policy by the Israeli state of unsettling and displacing Bedouin villages in the northern Negev desert to essentially take what was viable land for community construction and to turn this into settlements for Israeli citizens, excuse me. The village of al-Hiran, where this happened, by the time of 2017 had already been cleared, displaced, demolished and rebuilt by the same families over 100 times. And it was during this, one of the between the 100th and the 110th raid, as I recall, that an incident occurred in this village in which Yaqub Musa Abu al-Kiyan, who was a local maths teacher, and an Israeli police officer, Erez Levy, lost their lives. Now, the first thing that we knew of this was that official Israeli channels tweeted that there had been a terrorist incident in the context of this nighttime raid. Here you see the 18th of January, the dawn, and a crashed car which had been driven by al-Kiyan. Senior politicians lined up to vow that no such act would go unpunished. And at this point, two things happened simultaneously. First, our friends in the village, these are partners with whom we'd worked for a very long time, documenting that process of displacement and return, wrote to us to say that nobody believed for a moment that this man who had died was a terrorist. Indeed, Yaqub Musa Abu al-Kiyan was the local maths teacher, and at the time of his death, he had just been leaving the house of his elderly mother, where everybody in the village knew he cared for her. The second thing that happened was that the Israeli police tweeted the following video in support of their claims, a piece of evidence which immediately demanded further interrogation. They tweeted this video. The English translations are ours. And this video, shot on a thermal camera from a helicopter, they bring helicopters to these nighttime raids, purports to show the moment that al-Kiyan drives at the police officers using the car as a weapon of terrorism. Crucially, however, the accompanying statement suggested that this video demonstrated that al-Kiyan had driven at the police with his headlights off, and this began to raise questions for us because, well, this footage is of course thermal footage. The helicopter is shooting in thermal footage so that it can be legible at night time. If I just pause there, one of the things that's characteristic of thermal footage, of course, is that you can't see headlights because it detects heat, and not light. So while the implication was obviously of a sort of intentional violence on the part of al-Kiyan, such a condition is precisely what we want to, is exactly the sort of entry point, let's say, for investigative casework that we want to find when we enter into our cases. It's a moment where the state's own stated evidence offers something to which we can push back. And so we set about proceeding with our research on two tracks. First, we gathered what video documentation we could that existed on the ground, and within a digital model of the scene, we brought that on-the-ground footage into dialogue with the police helicopter footage. So here you're seeing the same incident as we saw from the helicopter. Here you'll see Abu al-Kiyan's car in the background. The camera has been drawn by the sound of gunshots. And what we're able to do using our digital models is to put this footage into dialogue, essentially, with the helicopter footage. So here you see how we're able to sync up videos between multiple perspectives. But what I want to show you here is how, from this footage, we can then move, we can then move from what we see here of Al Jazeera's footage. You see the officers, the police officers that Abu al-Kiyan is proposed to have driven into. And using our digital models, we're able then to move between video sources in order to, well, first of all, cross-corroborate, but secondly, begin to understand more about how this incident unfolds in relation to how the officers themselves and the Israeli military officials had declared it, because, of course, as we see in this footage, Abu al-Kiyan's lights are in fact on. The second thing that we did was moving from the digital into the physical reconstruction. We traveled to the village in person. This is a village, as I say, in the northern edge of the Negev Desert in southern Israel. We traveled to the village in person to reconstruct the incident in partnership with al-Kiyan's family. Here you see one of his brothers, and with his neighbors. And there we showed that the path of his car, as you can see here, after the shots were fired was in fact nothing more than a function of geography. It was a function of terrain. Something which is flattened in the helicopter footage becomes very evident when we travel and we test out the theories of the Israeli police physically and in person. So here you see how the two data sources in the digital and physical reconstruction are synchronized. You'll see that we place individuals at the locations of the officers, and you see how once our driver takes his foot off the wheel, by this time Abu al-Qiyan has been shot twice and killed almost instantly, you'll see that actually the path of the car is little more than a function of the terrain, and that this means that Erez Levi, the officer who was hit just in the bottom of the gulch there, was in fact killed by the sort of consequent actions of his own colleagues and the gunshots that they fired towards al-Qiyan. Now this was for us a really early demonstration of the power of bringing together digital reconstruction, digital technologies which we'd already been known for, and the possibility of physical reconstruction. And the combination that we can productively establish between the digital research techniques that are at our fingertips and the situated knowledge and experience of the witnesses to state violations. Now, victor is a few and far between in human rights work, but this was one of the relatively rare cases at that time where we were able to force a retraction from the Israeli state. Here you see Gilad Erdan, the security minister, accepting that the police may have been wrong, and ultimately a second minister apologizing for that death. So this was not only a success for us, but underlined the yards that we have to cover. You know, states can lie with a tweet, police forces can lie with a video, and it can take very many years of painstaking work, moving across disciplines, moving between borders to unwind that lie. Talking about this case now, it also makes me think how far we've come, that we were able at all to have the Israeli state apologize for the death of an individual civilian. Now, after publication, we commonly seek to activate our published work in pursuit of accountability in whatever form the conditions provide, recognizing that civil society needs to innovate in how we build truths and how we then build public around those truths. So here, we took the work to the Tate Britain. We were nominated for the Turner Prize in 2018, and this was a profile that we'd never been able to raise for ourselves before. You know, the Tate Britain here, one of a gallery at the heart of the British establishment, one of our oldest and most prestigious. It brought us new fans, it brought us new allies, it certainly brought us new detractors, but it crucially showed us how art galleries could be canvases for us to reach audiences in new ways and to tell stories in new and plural and indeed innovative ways. And indeed to speak on subjects that would otherwise be ignored in such forums. The maps that you see here, these are testament to 100 years of continuous living in the villages around al-Hiran by the family of the man that you see here and related families, and tells the story of over 100 destructions, displacements, and processes of return. These are stories which the Tate Britain very rarely tells. And in reflecting, I want to move next to a case in Germany, but in reflecting on the value of art institutions, I want to think a little bit about the foundation of the word forensics. Forensics is something which, or it's a word which has a Latin root, forensis, and this word forensis has become very determining for us. It's a word which defines a great deal of our practice. While we today understand forensics to be something like science in the service of law, this kind of constellation of technical and juridical processes by which a state identifies that a crime has been committed, finds who did it, proves that they did it, and then renders charge or sentence. This is not what forensics used to mean. Forensics, indeed in the Latin root forensis, means of or pertaining to the Roman Forum. The Roman Forum was a place of disputation, it was a place of argument, it was a place where you would win people to your side, not only by the validity of your claim, but by the strength of your rhetoric, and the convincing nature of your argument. And forensic architecture, in a sense, seeks a return to this understanding of disputation in forensics, a forensics of challenge and counter-argument, but a forensics also of plurality. Forensics, in the sense of the Roman Forum, was not the preserve of the state, it was the preserve of civil society. And indeed, in such a fashion, we call our work counter-forensics, that is, taking forensics back into civil society, turning the forensic gaze back on the state. And in doing so, we have to build our own forensic toolkit, some of which you've seen already and some more of which you will see. A toolkit based on civil society's own inherent advantages. They can be flexibility, innovation, interconnectedness, versatility, the ability to move and speak across forums, and in the face of often overwhelming state power and state control of information communication, counter-forensics uses the moment of the open source revolution, the breaking down of those barriers of information control, to marry aesthetic strategies of the art world with scientific and technical rigor in support, as ever, of political goals and political transformation. I want to take you next to Germany, to a case that we led and published a couple of years ago in a town called Hanau. This is Hanau, sleepy, somewhat historical, chocolate box sort of town. In 1813, Napoleon fought an Austro-Bavarian army here, and today it's a commuter town for a nearby financial centre in Frankfurt. But on 19th of February 2020, that peace was shattered by a killing spree across 2 locations. In just 6 minutes, a white German man living in the basement of his parents' home, a man known as a psychiatric risk to authorities, a man in legal possession, nevertheless, of 3 firearms, a man who had not long before this attack written letters to the local state police, to the local intelligence services, detailing his fear and hatred of immigrants and his intentions to act on that hatred. That man killed 9 individuals across 2 locations in just 6 minutes. After that, he returned to his house. Here is his house, and as police assembled outside, he killed his own mother and then himself, leaving alive inside the house his father, an equally venomous and racist man of similar extremist views. Now, these were the names of the 9 people that were killed that night. Modern Germany has a long history of neo-Nazi terror, of course, and of abject failures of policing in response. And Hanau was, again, a story of double violence, a story of violence and then state failure, state disinterest, indifference, and manipulation. And Hanau became, for migrant activism in Germany, and remains the kind of rallying cry, the never again moment, the césure, they say, the break. And it was into that context, 18 months after the attack, after 4 legal processes relating to the attack had closed down without any charges, that we were invited by an organization called the 19th of February Initiative to work and to investigate on their behalf. The initiative model is an incredible model of robust, flexible civil society investigative capacity. These are a group of individuals, civilians, non-experts, who become experts, who become expert activists and advocates. They become a support structure and family for the bereaved families and survivors of this attack. They understood instinctively the need to work across forums and to work, the pursuit of accountability is, let's say, a multi-platform project. And in doing so, notably, this initiative learnt from an initiative called the April 6th Initiative, another initiative with which forensic architecture had worked in the wake of another neo-Nazi murder, which was a similar catalogue of state failure, carelessness, and callousness. So this organization asked us to investigate how the police operation had failed on the night of the attack, how it had unfolded, and how and why they had failed to apprehend the perpetrator. I'm going to cover a little bit of our investigation, but what I want to mostly talk about is how that investigation was activated after it was published. Because the questions that they had asked us, these questions which were motivating their concern, gained a particular sharpness when the police special forces unit, which had responded to the attack, was disbanded because a majority of its members were found to have been trading in neo-Nazi memes. And so you had this extremely perverse environment in which neo-Nazis were chasing neo-Nazis around a small German town, and the only people that lost their lives were 9 Germans of migrant backgrounds. So to give you a very fleeting overview of a year's worth of investigative work, we interrogated the police response working not only from testimonies but from what you see here, which is police helicopter footage. We were able to identify the perpetrator's car. You'll see that the bonnet is still warm. He's very likely just arrived home after conducting these murders. But we were also able to use this police helicopter footage to identify undercover police cars by cross-referencing the times that we see in the helicopter footage with the testimony of officers, with the maps that they drew of where exactly they said that they moved. And what we're watching here is actually a police lie in action. Police card number 2, according to his own testimony, stays around here for another 35 minutes. That's important because this is the front door of the perpetrator's house. And yes, exactly, you can see it here. And the front door of the perpetrator's house is, of course, what this police officer was assigned to surveil. It's not clear why he left his post. It's not clear why he lied about when he left his post. But what we know is that that meant that for the first hour after this attack, the perpetrator, who'd just arrived home, could very easily have walked straight out of his front door again, even though the police knew exactly where he lived, and indeed that he was there. So I don't want to talk you through too many of the nuts and bolts of the investigation because it is a year's worth of work, and I can see that I'm already fating to run over time. But what I want to talk about is how this investigation was used, how its afterlife has grown and continues. Because our 2 investigations were published first in December 2021, then again in June 2022. After December 2021, the reason we published in December 2021 was precisely because of this committee process that you see here. In December 2021, the public hearings of the political inquiry into the Hanau terror attacks began, and the committee, just starting up, made what was quite a rare move, and a generous move in truth. They invited the survivors. You see here Saeed Edris Hashemi. He lost his brother in the attack. He was himself extremely gravely wounded in the attack. They invited survivors and bereaved families to come and to open up and to begin this inquiry by speaking of their experience. Now, this was a generous move in principle. It was also one which was ultimately extremely frustrating for the survivors and the bereaved families. Politicians largely on the right wing, you'll be surprised to learn, were highly uninterested to hear these statements. They were repeatedly chastised for reading newspapers during the statements, for eating sweets noisily during the statements. Extremely disrespectful, quite offensive stuff. But this, why I show you this image is because what Edris Hashemi brought to this inquiry and to his hearing really stopped them in their tracks. He brought with them a USB stick with our investigation and a 40-page methodology report outlining the steps by which he was going to prove certain arguments about what had happened to him. And this for us was a really wonderful moment. This is a moment of narrative seizing. This is a moment at which an individual like Edris here refuses to become subject of an inquiry and becomes the leader of the inquiry, begins to stake out what it is that we understand is true already about the conditions that this inquiry is going to investigate in and indeed investigate, and to show that civil society arrives into this process, that the survivors arrive into this process not as individuals waiting for guys in suits to explain to them what happened to them that night, but they bring investigative work, they bring the potential for future investigative work, and they challenge these politicians to raise their game. It's a challenge which I'm disappointed to say they did not rise to. Because the committee began its work and frankly has continued to disappoint all the way up until the publication of its final report, which was in December of last year. It became pretty quickly clear that this was a political process and not an investigative body. And so in June 2022, 6 months after Edris had presented at the parliamentary inquiry, we again provided the survivors and the bereaved families with this opportunity, a collaborative opportunity to take control of the narrative around how this case was being processed and understood. What you see here is a presentation of our first full investigative findings as a solo exhibition at Frankfurt's Kunstverein Gallery in June 2022. Here a number of very wonderful things happened. It's here that the chairman of the parliamentary inquiry saw for the very first time the helicopter footage that we had been working with He had been denied that material by federal investigators who were frankly embarrassed by what they saw there. And so it was only by his walking around this show, produced by ourselves and the bereaved and survivors, that the inquiry itself was able to advance and was able to call for evidential material that they otherwise didn't know existed. In the bottom right, you'll see that these videos here, these are in fact the survivors and bereaved families representing their statements, the statements that they gave in this tiny boxy room to a series of uninterested politicians, giving those statements again to multiple audiences, to thousands now of visitors, and reaching much more directly the German public who have received these statements in the spirit that they were meant to be heard. Here you see two pictures from our show's opening. You see survivors and bereaved families here standing in public. You see them speaking directly to genuinely an ad hoc assembled audience of Frankfurt locals. Now these are exactly the people that, let's say, live alongside one another, live alongside the migrant families here that naturally have very powerful things to say about how this attack itself is a condition of how they have been invisibilized and ignored. And you can see that this is an audience. I mean, this is, for us, this is like the Res Publica, right? This is the forum in action. This is individuals who have been wronged and harmed by the state, whose stories of that harm have then been traduced and diminished and ignored, taking control of that opportunity in the public square, in the heart of their urban environment, and drawing in an intentional and then an ad hoc crowd to hear them. From its first iteration, we received invitations to tour this exhibition around Germany. Here you're seeing the exhibition in Berlin. And it was here that we realized how the families and the bereaved survivors, the bereaved families and the survivors could really take control of this exhibition. And they did it very organically. They began every weekend to travel from Hanau up to Berlin. It's about 4.5 hours to lead presentations, to lead guided tours, initially to dozens and then eventually to hundreds of interested attendants. And there we saw something magical which we'd really never seen before, which was our forensic work, our research animated, frankly unforgettably, by the experiences of, again, Idris, a survivor, a man who walked out of the attack site with a bullet in his neck, animated by the experiences, the situated knowledge of the grieving mothers and fathers who had lost sons and daughters to this attack. The exhibition even became a newsroom itself. Here you see Armin Kurtovic, whose son Hamza was murdered in the Arena Bar, the second attack site. You see him presenting to news media evidence from the CCTV cameras on the night showing Hamza moving about the bar, developing evidence himself, presenting that in a forum created by him and us, which went on to found to form rather the foundation of a new legal appeal. At the heart of that presentation of data was this mural. One of the reasons we find galleries so valuable is because we can present extraordinarily detailed amounts of information, and we know that people will come with their notebooks and people will study and people will spend a great deal more time with that data than they do when we communicate to them through their phones, through their laptops. And this became really the most detailed account that has been made by any process, by anybody, of what happened on that night. You'll see that it progresses from 7 p.m. on the night of the attack, by the minute, sometimes even by the second, through every data point which is known about the attack, about the various actors, the police, the victims, the perpetrator himself, the helicopter comes later, the 999 calls that were made. And bringing all that data together into a graphic object like this. Once again, when the parliamentary inquiry's chairman saw this data, he immediately asked for copies to be distributed to all of his committee members. So I'm delighted to say that we're about 2 weeks away from opening a fourth iteration of this exhibition. Third iteration took the show back to Hanau. Here you see two of the most senior politicians in the state of Hessen, and indeed the third most senior politician in Germany, Nancy Faeser, being directed around our exhibition in its homeland, in its hometown indeed. This is probably 300 or 400 yards from the first attack site. You see Chetin here, his brother was murdered. He's talking to the most powerful politician in the state, telling him exactly what his police did right and did wrong. And again, it's in this combination of forensic reporting and investigation and storytelling on the walls, and the situated experience and perspective of those who've suffered with the results of what we've been detailing there for the subsequent years. It's there that we find something quite powerful, quite extraordinary and unusual, particularly for the dynamic that often exists between victims of terrorist attacks, particularly racialized and marginalized victims of terror attacks, bereaved families of terror attacks, and their politicians. We know, we've seen how well indeed these two individual politicians can brush past people in Chetin's position, how they can explain how sorry they are and move very quickly on. But in this space, Boris here is surrounded by data which is being animated and enlivened by Chetin and by his experience. So I want to take you next to Portland, indeed, by way of the US as a whole, to three investigations which have sort of charted the story of forensic architecture's relationship with Nina and with the Policing Justice show. So our involvement in Portland begins with the states as a whole. And what you're seeing here is the result of around 4 months of data gathering, open source investigation by a broad activist network, a volunteer network which spanned indeed from the west coast of the US to Turkey, I believe. We brought an international coalition of volunteer open source investigators together to document every single recorded instance of police violence against, first of all, protesters, but then subsequently journalists, legal observers, medics, to bring them together into a data object like this. This is using a custom software of our own making, a software that we call Time Map. And this is an interactive navigable platform by which you can pull up data and indeed source material where available about every single one of these, over 1,000 data points. Now we were by far, we were one of many organizations doing this mapping work. There were a wide range of organizations trying to make sense of this, this quite terrifying uptick in police violence that we saw in the second half of 2020. And our proposal was to build this information in such a way that it could become legible for accountability processes. So these data points that you see here have been submitted to a number of UN working committees, and we continue to be in discussion with the National ACLU about how data mapping like this can become active in support of their legal work against the US. We verified more than 1,000 such incidents between June 2020 and February 2021, and more than 45% of those incidents that we documented were here in Oregon, the great majority of them in Portland. You don't need me to tell you, I'm sure, what a locus for the protest movement Portland became, demographically America's whitest city, yet at the front line of generational protests for racial justice. And a city which, and perhaps some of you were among them, grew very familiar with the acrid taste of tear gas, which has been something of a research interest for us in recent years, ever since the 2019 investigation, Triple Chaser, which Nina mentioned. It's easy to understand why tear gas has become such a central component of the toolkit of authoritarian policing. It is fluid, it's fast moving, it's indiscriminate, it dissipates quickly, it's hard to track. And as our director has written, where protests have a kind of fundamentally centrifugal quality, where they draw individuals together into collective action, building collectives out of individuals, tear gas operates centripetally. It breaks unified masses into individuals again, into terrified and hurt individuals, choking them, forcing them into self-preservation. It's what Sloterdijk calls atmoterrorism, the domination of humans through the domination of their shared atmosphere. And so working in partnership with local groups, we sought to carry out an investigation in Portland itself, one which would complement local and national movements toward banning the use of tear gas which is of course banned in interstate conflict since the Geneva Conventions, but continues to be a weapon used liberally by police in the US and around the world. A partner at an organisation called Physicians for Human Rights once lamented to us that the problem with tear gas for advocacy purposes was that it didn't operate like impact munitions, like so-called less lethal impact munitions, whereby the damage was tangible, often physically enduring. And the question that they said us really was, how can you investigate and how can you advocate around something which you can barely grab hold of? And so it was that we wanted to put tools, evidence, new data in the hands of frontline activists and offer it to them to see how they could use those new technologies. So we began, as you can see here, first to model downtown Portland and to begin experimenting with the use of computer fluid dynamics simulations to see if we could find ways to procedurally through simulated reconstruction of an urban environment and weather conditions, estimate the quantities of tear gas used by the PPB on a given night during that protest season. We chose the night of 2nd of June 2020, a night known as Tear Gas Tuesday. The investigation began, as many of our investigations do. We bring together data sources, not only open source image documentation, but also orders of sale from the Portland Police, technical specifications. There you're seeing other documents made public by the Portland Police. And what we did is we turned all of that data into a kind of an analytic typology. We determined that there were 6 broad visual signatures for types of munitions that were used by the PPB on those nights. We began to locate them within over 200, I believe, geolocated images, geolocated and chronolocated images, and then we used a conservative sort of formula algorithm for estimating how much CS or OC would have been or could have been in each of those emission points. By emission points, I mean this map. This is a selection of the locations that we know that the PPB fired a munition and it went down. Now, we don't, in every case, know exactly what those munitions were, and that was where our conservative algorithm came in to make sure that as far as possible, when we were trying to work out airborne concentrations of CS gas resulting from these emission points, that we were being actually as fair, let's say as generous as possible to the PPB in order that we couldn't be accused of overestimating or sensationalizing our results. So emission points such as these are one of our input data into the computer fluid dynamics simulation. And another input data is the weather simulation. Of course, historic meteorological data is widely available. The software that we work with, a software called Visit, is able to import those weather conditions into the digital environment, producing, when in combination with the emission points, producing what you see here. You're seeing a simulation of the progress through the air and around the urban fabric of downtown Portland of a conservative estimate of the CS gas that was released by the PPB on the 2nd of June 2020. Now, what these two modes of analysis, the airborne movement of tear gas and what you're seeing is coloured ground deposition, these allow us to assess the impact of tear gas in 2 ways. First of all, the distribution spread. We can see that frankly, I'll be honest, we underestimated. This is the bounds of the simulated environment that we created. You can see that we went up to around 800 meters away from the emission sources. At that point, the tear gas is still traveling, and it's still settling in concentrations which are, as we will see, around the level which is recognized internationally as dangerous to life and health. Our simulation estimated that just on that night alone, a minimum of 2 kilos of CS would have been deposited in the Willamette, which is the river you see here, of course. So from our ground deposition map, we can show just exactly how indiscriminate tear gas is. What we're seeing here is the consequence of the Portland police extremely lazily trying to solve a problem 800 meters away and causing health impacts and environmental consequences 800 meters, and I believe we could say up to 1 kilometer or more away. But we're also able to use that simulation to assess airborne concentrations. What we do there is we take a sample size, a sample volume, 6 meters by 6 meters by 3 meters, and we measure the throughput of CS through that location. Now you can see that we chose a handful of sample locations within the protest area. You'll see that we also chose a handful of sample locations downwind of the protest areas on that night. To put these numbers in context, these are milligram per meter cubed concentrations. The level that has been internationally recognized as immediately dangerous to life and health, is 2 milligrams per meter cubed. You'll see that every single one of our sample locations blew that level, some of them by up to 2,000 times the level at peak moments. Now it's important to caveat these results. Everything about our work is about modeling reality, and models are always fall short of reality. Models are necessarily insufficient and incomplete versions of reality in which salient features are as far as possible reconstructed, and what can't be reconstructed is caveated. But that's for exactly that reason that we were as conservative as we thought that we could possibly be with the emission points and the emission quantities. And still we find that in every location that we sample within our distribution area, we see that a level which was known to the PPB, is blown. So then the question really becomes, again, what can we do with this data? How can it be activated? We offered this, our findings and our data to, first to the ACLU of Oregon, who took this work into a case against DHS, which they sadly lost. And there are forthcoming cases, at least one case in 2024 in Portland, which we will be providing this material to. Exactly with a view to, as Physicians for Human Rights had challenged us, making tangible this invisible, dissipating fluid violence that we see from the PPB. And demonstrating, I hope, perhaps what didn't need to be demonstrated, that when the PPB are using these kinds of weapons, they are not doing so carefully, they're not doing so discriminately, they're not doing so from a position of experience, they're not doing so from a position of, let's say they're not trying to solve problems, the problems which are really there in the protest environment. They are providing lazy ways of clearing streets highly indiscriminately, poisoning neighborhoods hundreds of meters away, rather than, let's say, managing a collective group of citizens and their democratic right to protest. Now, it was through this case that we were connected to the story of June Knightley. We didn't know it, but as we were getting into the technical weeds of fluid dynamic simulation and CS quantities, the investigative reporter Robert Mackey, formerly of The Intercept, was doing a very different kind of investigative work, very traditional investigative work, earning the trust of a network of anti-fascist protest facilitators, some of whom had been there on the night of 2nd of June 2020, and who had been members of a corking protest support group with June Knightley. Now, they were a group who were extremely sensitive to the possibility of journalists misreporting their story. They had held on to that story for a number of years until such time as Rob was able to persuade them that with our techniques and our position sort of within and without of journalism and the research ethical guidelines by which we're bound at the University of London, that we could be a space and a kind of a conduit for them to tell that story. In doing so, we'd use a very different methodology, an altogether more human-led research practice, something that we call situated testimony. Situated testimony is an example of which you're seeing here. Situated testimony is an interviewing practice that we have developed. Is it not playing? Which uses digital models, uses 3D models of the scenes of human rights violations and other such incidents of trauma to interview witnesses and survivors of those incidents themselves. So what you're seeing here, this man survived life in a Syrian torture prison for, I believe, 4 or 5 years. And he, of course, had been interviewed a number of times as he exited this prison by Amnesty International, who would ask him the traditional fare of human rights interviewing, which is to say, sorts of questions like, what did they do to you? How many bodies did you see? What did you see them do to other people? We started somewhere completely different. We said, well, we have a satellite image of this facility. We want to build the rest of it. So what did it look like inside? And what we find is that as people are interviewed about an environment in which they have experienced or witnessed trauma, we see very interesting interrelations, interactivity between traumatic memory and spatial memory. Now, I should say that this is a procedure which begins and proceeds in a very trauma-informed environment. It was developed with the forensic psychology department at Goldsmiths, which is really field leading in the interviewing of trauma victims. And so what we do is we slowly and patiently, over many hours, we sit with survivors and we collaboratively reconstruct with them. Here you'll see our interviewing of a group of survivors from the bombing of the Mariupol Drama Theatre, that's this building here, by Russian forces in the context of their invasion. And so what we do is we build a digital model of the environment. We bring together actually multiple interviewees. The model becomes a kind of a venue for the cross-corroboration of testimony. So you'll see here that we interviewed up to, I think, 9 individuals. And these witnesses, what we find is that in such a process, being in front of this model and being asked questions, spatial questions about how the building was put together, how life in the building operated, the witness can't help but be drawn into their recollection through the recognition of this environment which both is and is not the scene of violence. It is obviously recognizable as that, but it's also something which is at a remove, which is clearly not that. The edges of it are visible. And you'll see here that we engage in quite mundane kind of questioning about very simple, very small details. And it's as that process proceeds over sometimes up to 4, 5, 6 hours with breaks, interspersing what we know from those interviews with photo evidence, for example, that our witnesses begin to re-enter that environment in interesting ways. They begin to re-enter that environment from a position we found anecdotally of control, of productivity, of being suddenly, an environment that they had previously only experienced as subjects of trauma, as subjects of violence and force, in this case explosions, planes flying above them every day, a condition of complete powerlessness. They return to that environment as architects, as really as godlike constructors. Things will appear and disappear as they tell those stories. And you can see then how we integrate those interviews with our more traditional sort of photo matching technologies in order to tell stories about what life was in that environment. And so a process which really began in earnest 8 years ago, interviewing survivors of that Syrian torture prison earlier this year, arrived here in Oregon. Now the case of June Knightley's murder, I suppose, is one which is relatively familiar to most of you. In February 2022, just over 2 years ago, a group of anti-fascist activists, protest support workers were gathered on the west side of Normandale Park in northeast Portland to protect a regular demonstration that was leaving from there, a demonstration for racial justice. And that group was attacked. That group was attacked by an extremist perpetrator, a guy called Ben Smith. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how the process of situated testimony unfolded in this case, because these interviewees were a particularly remarkable cohort. So here we had to conduct our interviews remotely. Here you see my colleague, Jumana. She's working from London, working late overnight as these interviews are conducted during the day, PT time. And so here you see how interviewees are invited to study the model, to see how it comes together, how we've built this from, as she says here, from photogrammetry, to be introduced to the behind the scenes of the model in order to familiarize themselves before the model leads, the model is led by the interviewee before the, pausing again, before the interviewee's recollection and interaction with the model is reflected then in almost real time by Jumana. So you'll see Jumana is taking notes on what is said, wherever possible, reacting instinctively to what's being described. And this is that generative, productive, almost godlike quality that the interviewees are able to bring back to this traumatic experience of and recollection, that they are all of a sudden able to move and manipulate this environment entirely freely, to step away from it at any time. And then, of course, we post-produce those materials for the purposes of the final film. Now it also becomes, as you saw in the case of Mariupol, it also becomes a venue for analysing video evidence. One of the survivors, Deja Beck, was wearing a helmet camera. At the time, the video that she captured culminates in a quite extraordinary record of her own shooting. And one of the very many remarkable qualities that our interviewees in this case demonstrated was the painstaking detail in which they'd come to understand Deja's video. They really could have been forgiven for never looking at that video again. But rather, they actually came to understand it, that footage, frame by frame. That was footage that they had already deeply studied before we arrived, and as we actually offered to take them very painstakingly through that material, much of that offer had already was something that they had already done for themselves. And you see here how Ali, who was shot there, she was shot ultimately 4 times, is able to feel secure enough to guide us through this video, to really make real on this promise. Here you see this extraordinary footage of Deja, who was shot twice and survived. You'll see that Ali is able to talk us through this material, really making good on this offer that we hope to make with situated testimony, to create an environment, a digital environment, but then also an interviewing environment, a space, a trauma-informed and rounded space in which she can begin to really drive the investigation, really be the investigator in that case. I just want to finish by briefly talking about some of the context around the moments of this shooting, because These interviewees were corkers. This might be a practice which some of you are familiar with in passing. It was something that we'd never heard of, and we were frankly thrilled to learn more about and to help these interviewees communicate further. Corking is a community practice, a practice of putting one's body, vehicle, motorbike, car into intersections in order to protect marchers. This group, Deja and Ali and her, and indeed Eugene and the others, they would support marches for progressive causes, everything from racial justice and climate justice to Palestine. And they would do so by this really remarkable, as I say, a community practice, one which is totally symbiotic with the structure and the geography of Portland. They have a claim to be able to do this practice better than anyone else in the world. As we know, Portland was out protesting for nearly 200 nights consecutively. And so we were able to make this offer to them to help them to explain visually what that practice was, to export that knowledge from their heads, from their fingertips, really, into a kind of a presentation environment like this. And I'm really delighted that within days of this investigation going online, they had already ripped these animations out of them and put them on their own website to share that extremely situated, extremely hyper-specific expertise. Now the film also describes how these practitioners became collateral in the city's demonization of protesters, targeted by right-wing online influencers, by the toxic rhetoric of political discourse, because in the hours after the attack, as many of you might know, the PPB announced that this had been a shooting between armed protesters and an armed homeowner, and you see here how that news raced around national and indeed international media before the truth was able to get out there. And so we are really very grateful to have been the medium by which those to whom that violence did the most harm were able to correct the record. A record, incidentally, which is still online today. I took this off the PPP's website yesterday. What's remarkable is that they did even tell us as we published this and we went to them for right of reply that this had been corrected, and it hadn't. I mean, it's not the most dramatic example that we've ever worked with, but it's quite, I think it demonstrates the sort of everyday nature of this double violence that I spoke about at the top, that now it's entirely routine, that your local police force will tell you one thing is true, while on their own website the opposite is the case. The last thing they told us was that this was no longer online. So I want to finish just by returning to PICA, and to this notion of coalition, which I've talked about a couple of times at the top, of voices from across disciplines talking in union, because again, we can actually find valuable guidance for our methodology and our practice in the Latin roots. Coalition comes from coalescere. Coalescere means to grow together. And it actually itself comes from or contains this root alessere, which is to nourish, or to be nourished, indeed, to be fed and to grow. And so when we talk about acting in coalition, when we talk about speaking across disciplines and working in coalition, that's really our ambition, to provide technical tools and methodologies which both grow the capacity of other arms of civil society to pursue accountability, but which are themselves also nourished and grown by interaction with, for example, if you see in the top left here, Don't Shoot Portland, a really, really wonderful activist organization with whom we've been connected in the process of growing towards this exhibition. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you very much. I'd look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was really, really enlightening talk, and I'm so glad that you were able to include some installation shots as well. That gives everyone a little sense of what the exhibition looks like as well. Are there any questions? We're going to use the microphone just for the recording.
So internally, how do you measure success on an individual case-by-case basis?
Good question. Question that that we think a lot about. I mean, every one of our cases is so unique. In fact, we really try not to do the same case twice. So it becomes quite difficult to compare. We don't have any metrics, let's say. Yeah, exactly. So, there are the obvious wins. As I say, if the Israeli state says that a guy's a terrorist and we can show that he wasn't, and they'll admit that, then we'll take that. Most of our cases don't result in such clean pushback. I think standing in PICA on Friday night and watching the survivors of the Normandale Park attack show their parents this story, their parents who'd flown in from across the country, show them this story, that they had finally, after a number of years, felt that they had a trusted and safe environment to present that story. For me, that's success. That's in itself a valuable act and a contribution to that scene, this scene which we have such respect for. But it's also, what I really hope. I mean, it's the first time that we've shown in Oregon. We've shown a couple of times in the US. Funnily enough, after the Whitney Biennial and the Triple Chaser show and the controversy around that, we don't get very many invitations in the US anymore. But it's also, the success is also in the presentation of the work, putting it in relation to and alongside, some of the most deeply rooted and robust activism of organizations like Don't Shoot. We consider that success.
How does one get into forensic architecture?
It's a good question. I used to give quite a lot of talks back at the journalism school that I worked at. That I learned at, and I realised that I was repeating quite a frustrating comment that I would hear a lot when I was studying there. You'd be invited to lectures by guests who were, running investigations departments in major newspapers, and they'd say, well, I can give you X, Y, Z tips, but basically you've just got to be a nice person and take opportunities and, hope, and eventually the luck will break your way. And I always find that an incredibly unhelpful answer, obviously. And entirely by chance at a journalism conference, I bumped into some members of forensic architecture, and they said, sure, come and join us for a couple of weeks. That was when I found this US military contractor, and I owe that guy my career here, really. I think we have an MA program which draws from which we draw quite a lot of our junior researchers. So we have a graduate studies program, the Center for Research Architecture, which has around 15 MA students every year. We give them a lot of placements on our project teams, and I'd say maybe a quarter to a third of them come and work for us, depending on how many we're able to hire each year. So we draw people from quite specialized kind of academic input, I suppose, but we also, it's always been our director's kind of joy, I believe, to grab people in situations like he grabbed me and put them in and see what happens. So I was the first journalist on staff. After that, we hired a lawyer briefly, but to work as a researcher rather than to work as a legal department. We hired a psychologist to go back over actually some of our situated testimony cases and see how they could propose that we can kind of reshape our practice. We've just hired an activist from an organisation that we worked with in London a couple of years ago on a part-time contract, just to see if kind of community organising as a discipline, when it comes into contact with these techniques in-house every day, whether that can change the way that we think and we work. There's no good answer to your question, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Hi, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I just was thinking about, you've touched on this a little bit in terms of the relationship of forensic architecture and journalism and journalists today. And I just, wanted to see if you could elaborate on that a bit, just considering, given the era of news now where newsrooms are gutted, there's corporate ownership, they don't have much in the way of resources, and that makes it particularly susceptible for PR manipulation by state and corporate sources. And I just wonder how you've seen the interaction of journalists and media outlets with forensic architecture's investigations, whether it just stands in the sort of context of competing truth claims that, here's what forensic architecture says, and here's what official sources say, make your own decision, which is kind of the default in journalism. Here are these competing views, just make your own, sort of make your own determination, versus is forensic architecture's work driving journalism? You gave some examples of that, but if you could just talk about that a bit, just the relationship of this project and journalism in a particularly difficult time.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, there's lots of questions, really. There's a few things I could say. So, one thing to say is that when I joined forensic architecture in 2017, that was really when the kind of visual investigations as a journalistic mode was really taking shape. The New York Times visual investigation team, for example, was just founded up by late 2017. Washington Post, BBC followed. I know The Guardian are really keen to follow, but as you said, they have no money to do it. So there was a time where we were really darlings of that world, and everybody wanted to work with us, as we kind of understood then and we clearly understand now, because what they wanted to do was see how they could do something approximating our work on the cheap, and how they could, how they could do this to journalistic deadlines, basically, right? And you see better or worse examples of that. The visual investigations team at the Times is exceptional. They've actually hired architectural researchers themselves now, so their models are serious, and their commitment to accuracy is certainly evident. There's a risk of this work being eye candy, right? We've had enough contact from editors who say, I'm not sure exactly how, but I just really want to work with you guys because it looks great, right? And that's not really the attitude that we want to begin these engagements with. Now, what those engagements look like, you really hit the nail on the head, actually. What's frustrating for us is or what we try and avoid, or let's say what's kind of priced in, but it's not really interesting to us, is when is that kind of stenography, or that kind of the kind of reporting of both sides. State lies, civil society says they didn't lie. Observes lie, state says they didn't lie. You make up your own mind, and that doesn't, for us, that's not a very rewarding mode of storytelling. And I think, the conditions I was talking to at the start, they're created by that issue, right? They're created by that failure of journalism. We've fallen into a logic of reporting which says that the way that you do it is you put a microphone in front of as many voices as possible, and you write down everything they've said, and then you leave it. And of course I'm homogenizing, and there's quite broad brushes here, and there's people doing richer work than that, but that's a problem mode, and one that we want to push against. And the way that we try and push against it, this is a kind of I suppose there's a bit of a window here in the non-technical work that we do, the kind of the strategy, the kind of reasons why we might want to hire activists and organizers, because we look at that interest that comes from journalism, from, The Guardian says, we just want to work with you. What have you got? And we say, okay, well, how can we use this? How can we sneak in through the front door, bring a story, bring a way of telling this story, and without being too simplistic, take them so far down the road that they've invested themselves too much when we say, well, this is actually what we're going to say here. This is how we're going to carry this story. We've learned to be a lot bolder about editorial lines and about using their commitment to us, their desire to work with us, leveraging that and saying, okay, we're happy to work with you, but you have to take this kind of line, and you have to speak in this way, and you have to go further than this kind of problematic reporting that you highlighted. Obviously for me, coming to forensic architecture from a journalistic background, it's what I think about a lot, is how we can best use a very flawed medium, and how we can try and improve a flawed medium and challenge it, honestly, we find presenting in galleries much more rewarding because many of those same problems aren't there. There's so much more freedom. There's so much more freedom to present at length as well. You know, this is a 35-minute film, nearly 40-minute film on the murder of June Knightley. The drop-off statistics on Vimeo are really, really horrifying for all of our videos. Very, very few people watch past like 3 minutes online, because when do you watch anything online for more than 3 minutes? It's not on Netflix. So these are great spaces because this is where people come, as I said, with a notepad. This is where people come and they really go deep, and they come back and they come back. Anyway, I've gone off topic there, sorry. Thanks.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I was thinking about the context of art. What are the implications of presenting this type of work, which is rooted in investigative journalism, in the context of art? You mentioned the fact of creating a broader platform. Now you talked about freedom and also attention. So I was thinking, how did your approach change through time in the using, visual devices and spatial devices in presenting this type of materials in an artistic context with respect to more traditional media journalism?
Again, it's a very good question, and it's quite a few questions in one. So as you've remarked, I've covered some of this already, but I think that we're trying to tell stories in a different that aren't easily sort of captured by traditional media journalistic modes, and so it's for us it's really self-evident that the most productive place to do that is on our website and in galleries, and nobody, people don't visit websites that aren't social media or news sites anymore. So and they certainly don't do that to go and watch 40-minute films. So it's galleries where that stuff works. It's also, as I showed with the mural in Hanau, we have a lot of flexibility there to take people under the hood and to show, to experiment with graphic presentation. But I feel like I've maybe made that point already. I wanted also to touch on the Triple Chaser investigation, because what we learned there, as Nina said, the punchline, we managed to get the board of trustees, vice chairman, ejected from that board. He was asked to resign because we and a great many other activist groups around that biennial as well made a lot of noise about how he was profiting from tear gas being used against, almost anyone. Now, that for us, that also had quite a kind of, it was a success. It was one of those successes, but it also taught us that, well, I don't know if it taught us something complete, but it opened up this possibility for us. Someone like Warren Kanders. So this is a guy who, who makes an awful lot of money off the sale of chemical weapons, and then gives some of that money to institutions and launders his reputation thereby. All of that, that entire pipeline is obviously totally legal and basically encouraged, and I've no doubt he's got a contact book full of politicians. The only field in which we were able to bloody his nose, give him something back for all of that pain that he's profited from, was in the cultural space, and that's something that really encouraged us to kind of foreground and forward our engagement with art spaces. It's hard not to be a little bit defeatist about it as well. The cultural spaces become more valuable to us as court processes and political processes repeatedly fail to deliver anything that looks like accountability, and force us to speak in very narrow ways. We do, of course, but what we really want is to be in both the gallery and the courtroom at the same time. And we have had some really wonderful examples where that's worked. And, actually what we find sometimes there is that there was the first case that we did in Germany. We entered into the courtroom and they said, "Why are we dealing with this piece of art in here? This is," and the other side drew up dossier going through all of our CVs saying this person's a video editor, not an investigator. This person went to art school, why are we trusting them? And then at the same time across town, the same work was in Documenta in Kassel, and there the reviews were saying, what on earth is this piece of evidence doing in the art gallery? This should be in the courtroom, this should be in the parliamentary inquiry. That kind of productive tension we really enjoy, we really thrive on. But what I wanted to say is that, you know, while we do want to be in the courtroom, inevitably we have to compromise to get there, and we have to strip away so much of what we want to say. You know, let's talk about when we're investigating racist violence by police, when we're investigating black men killed by police, whether it's in the US or the UK or anywhere else. What we can say about why that happened, the real why of why that happened, is so limited in a courtroom. You know, and of course we trade off this moonshot hope of, you know, landing a police officer with a conviction for murder. You know, we haven't done that yet. Maybe we never will. But we trade off so much to get there and to have that chance, when actually what we can say in courtrooms, when we can start to work with community activists, we can start to tell a story of that murder which is 70 years long rather than 1 minute long. You know, we find that to be, we find ourselves more at home with that. Sorry, it's a huge question. I hope some of it's answered. Come back if there's anything else.
Thanks so much for being here. It's really exciting to hear this work shared here. I have two questions. The first one is fairly simple and straightforward, and the second one is impossible to answer, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it anyway. The first one is about the corking visualization, and whether you think about that on some level as being, you know, both a manual or tool for others, but also as a give back to the people that you were collaborating with.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, that's the easy one. The more straightforward question. So the harder one goes back to the beginning of the talk and your what you described as this insurgence, if I am quoting correctly, against truth.
Yeah.
And this moment of, you know, kind of this very quickly changing media landscape or ecology, and the simultaneous consolidation of power or rise of the far right in many, many places. And your suggestion that part of that has to do with the fact that the right perhaps had better recognized and harnessed control over aspects of media or media representation. I don't know if that's what you meant to say, but I wondered if you could speak. I think it relates to the wonderful question earlier about kind of the moment that we're in now with journalism. But you were speaking more to kind of the early 2010s, kind of the early days of forensic architecture, and just thoughts about media and politics and power, like in a kind of broader context.
You're right, that is impossible to answer. I'm probably not the person to expound upon whether the fact that when existing information structures, the information dissemination structures entirely broke down, that whether the fact that that happened in about 2011, and by 2016 we had Brexit and you had Trump, whether that, and I mean it's so kind of basic and ham-fisted to go with that arc, but for shorthand's sake anyway, I'm not the person to expound really on whether that was sort of built into the system or circumstantial, or a bit of both, probably a bit of both many times over, but it certainly happened, right? Now, I don't know if that's because, well, no, okay. In the UK, I'd say that happened because what we consider to be the centre politically and socially is will never admit that it's more sympathetic to the right than it is to the left, and so will always give the right more of a hearing than the left, and will follow it down that garden path, and that's I think what happened. that there was, if ever there was an opportunity to present a united front in support of basic shared honesty in communication and politics, we completely missed it, partly because of that symptom. But, you know, even as I say that, I'm like, okay, there's like 12 other reasons why that happened as well, right? Whyever it happened, that's the kind of central orienting challenge for FA, fundamentally. What on earth can you do to rebuild a relationship between someone who wants to say something true and someone who wants to hear something true and act on it? And how do you do that in completely conditions which are not prevailing, let's say. And so, you know, some of those are aesthetic strategies. The fact that the work is eye candy at times, I'm not ashamed to admit, is something which is helpful to us. You know, we can, you know, people want to be persuaded. People want to understand, and they want to follow, and that's it's, as I said, states will lie, but they will lie in very boring ways. They will lie in ways which are not always highly convincing, often. I say that, and I caveat, because now actually we see the Israeli state doing its own kind of OSINT coverage in this latest invasion. So they, you know, states will also ape civil society, but civil society will always be more flexible, will always be more versatile, and will have opportunities to be more persuasive. And so, you know, whether we're talking technically, whether we're talking in terms of aesthetic strategies and using that work to be convincing because of what it is, what it looks like, or whether we're talking about kind of community engagement strategies like this. Yeah, we are more flexible and innovative than states, and I suppose we're just iterating in how it might be possible that we can exploit that. Again, I mean, impossible to answer, and I didn't. So. I'm happy to hear responses from any of these. They're all really big and broad and great questions, and I'm only partly answering them. If you want to come back again, then feel free.
Hi,
Hey.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have to apologize about two things before I ask my question. One, I came in halfway, so you may have mentioned this already.
No problem.
Two, I work in 7th to 8th century Buddhist art, so I have very little responsibility to the people who produce the work that I work on, and my relationship is kind of always unidirectional. My question is, I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship that you forge with the people who are providing stories for you, and it seems to me that the relationship comes with a tremendous responsibility, and how, after you produce the work, what happens to that relationship?
It's another very good question. It's hard to talk in principle about that. You know, I can talk from the experience of that handful of cases that I've worked on. You know, where we've had that long and enduring relationship, and maybe, I mean, the place that I started was to say that in our early years in forensic architecture, we were a lot more of a kind of a remote sensing project. The early cases, the cases that kind of made our name, were in places that I suppose the trick was casting eyes into places that we couldn't reach otherwise, right? So we'd be using satellite images and found video to report on chemical weapons attacks in Syria, on the inside of Cameroonian special forces bases, you know, reaching drone strikes over Afghanistan and Waziristan. So we'd be using the technology to reach somewhere we couldn't be. That's not as much how we work now, and much more now we find ourselves in these situations where we do have these relationships of responsibility. You know, of course they vary. Their textures vary in every case. You know, in the case in Hanau, our relationship is mediated through my pretty broken German, the second language German of the family members of the victims and the survivors. You know, you have a kind of a young cohort who speak fluent German, who were raised in Germany. You have their parents, some of them the parents of the victims, whose German may itself be pretty limited, and we kind of actually there's a very lovely relationship to try and communicate in one second language each like that, and but it, you know, it can also kind of obstruct exactly that, how deep a relationship like that can be. That same problem is not reflected here in Normandale Park. I can say that, you know, it has been a total pleasure in the last couple of days to meet finally some of those interviewees who we've interviewed remotely. They came with a gift set for us and things, the kind of things that were we to consider ourselves journalists in the truest sense, we'd have to have declined. And I'm glad that that's not the case, and I feel much more natural in that state. You know, we try to consider that our cases never really close. So we're always, you know, in the absence of kind of close the book successes, we're always now in these struggles with these families and these individuals. And you know, we honestly, sometimes I'm better at maintaining contact with them than I am with my friends, those that live overseas, because you know that this is something that, I mean, it's also work that I'm extremely proud of and in love with, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to be part of this team, which can, you know, provide even a change of story, even if usually we don't, you know, we never get the officer convicted or the sentence overturned. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling again. It's something that I reflect on all the time. In fact, as I was here with the survivors of Normandale, I was receiving texts from the mother of a young man who was killed by the police in Amsterdam, because I hadn't replied to her email for 4 days because I'd been in the kind of last minute rush with this film, and so yeah, it's they are very sensitive relationships. They are things that, you know, that we they can be very difficult. They can be traumatizing relationships as well. And you know, I suppose to change tack slightly, because it's that relationship with the stories, a relationship with the individuals, which also touches upon, I think, how we understand our work in the context of trauma and vicarious trauma, particularly. You know, we obviously do a great deal of briefing for our junior researchers, and we have a lot of check-in time and welfare oversight with our researchers to ensure, you know, the very simple stuff, like if you're looking at videos which have bloody violence in them, watch them in grayscale, watch them minimized, turn the sound off. You know, there are practical things you can do like that. But I think something that's unique about what we try and discuss with our researchers when they arrive, and it's something that our director is really keen to constantly underscore, and it's something which makes other people in the field of vicarious trauma workshops a little bit nervous, is he said, you know, we shouldn't shy away from that trauma, that inhabiting that trauma that comes of hearing these stories and seeing this material is, you know, that we have to, if we're serious about the work, we have to make peace with the fact that, in a sense, we want that as well. You know, that we want to get into that and to help them with that, right? And that's not something that we should be only trying to exclude or ignore or mitigate. I hope that's part of an answer. Thanks.
Any final questions? One more quick one. Okay.
This is not a lofty question, but do you ever get blowback where you're shining like a very crisp light, some very dark elements like warlords and neo-Nazis? Do you ever get blowback or security issues or anything?
Yeah, some. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to valorize this or anything. We've never poked anyone big enough in the eye hard enough to really get serious blowback. But yeah, you know, I mean, there's a lot of politicians across Europe that say that we're fake news and liars, and they all used to say that we were puppets of George Soros long before Open Society Foundations actually gave us any money. Yeah, the Italians would call us Sorosianos for quite a long time. But that, again, it's not because we're us, it's because we're saying the thing they don't want to hear, and it's the reflex instinct. Yeah, I mean, it's something that we account for at the start of every case. We know that the online right in and around Oregon and in the US is no joke, and that things can get ugly there, and that's something that we certainly accounted for in terms of our safety and also the safety of the people that we work for. What does it mean to come out with something bold and big around the story? Are we going to escalate risk for them? But and I mean, I suppose the kind of the primary area of concern at the moment is the work that we're doing around Gaza. We know again that the Israeli state is not by any means above cyber warfare, but well, you don't know until you know, I guess. But so far, so good.
Are you working to falsify data? Like AI video could really throw you for a loop, for example.
That's an interesting one, actually. I don't agree. I think the Sora, is it called Sora? The kind of text to video prompt thing, it's super interesting. But I'd be very surprised if that is more has a greater potential for disinformation than what we already have. And what I mean by that is that Gaza is a good example. A lot of the misinformation that we see around online, Twitter, on Facebook about Gaza right now is that people will post a picture and say, Israel has just bombed this house. And it won't be a picture of Gaza, it'll be from Syria in 2018 or something, right? But the lie works, for whatever the purpose of the lie. It's not that, the concern around deepfakes is that is simply that people will believe the thing they're seeing because it looks like the thing that it says it is, but it's not, right? But that's already happening. You don't need fake video for that. You just show a picture of another bombed out building and you say this is Gaza. Half of the people will believe you, right? So I don't suppose it's great to have loads and loads and loads of fake media in circulation, but I don't know that it changes the quality of the problem, only maybe the scale. Because we're already, that kind of disinformation that we're worried about is already happening. And maybe let's take a step back from the text to video OpenAI stuff. I don't know what you'd call that technology where you can change somebody's lips, the shape of somebody's lips. It's something similar as well, right? It's kind of algorithmic reorganization of pixels in a video file. That stands out like a sore thumb in metadata analysis of video, right? Even if it's a bit, even if you might be tricked by that by watching the video, you'll never be like that kind of editing. It's impossible to do that in a way which is which evades the kind of let's say sort of file depth analytic tools that are available. And that's not super high tech stuff. That's just that metadata can't, the file itself and the metadata and the pixels themselves can't really be manipulated in a way which isn't easily evident. So it's the real pictures misrepresented which are the problem, and they're already the problem. That's my view anyway. Come back to me in 2 years, I might be spectacularly wrong.
You're also going out and talking to the people who took those.
Yeah, I mean that's something I often said is like that. You have, there were lots of videos going around of people using the lip editing to make Obama say things that he hadn't said, right? And one of the things that's fundamental in FA is that we never single source things. We never, and wherever possible, we don't single source videos, because if there'd been another camera in that room with Obama and you saw that one, it would be obvious that it's kind of a big tick for the fundamental methodologies of FA that more than one camera, more than one perspective, and you can't fall prey to those kinds of errors. Those are problems of single sourcing.
Right. Yeah. In relation to that, real quick, the most watched film of all time is the Zapruder film, President Kennedy being assassinated. Have you ever thought about modeling that as a forensic just to see if there's anything to be gained from that?
No, we haven't thought about JFK. Okay. I'd say the biggest classic we've been asked to do is Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN chief who crashed, his plane crashed, well, whose plane was shot down. Yeah, archival material makes those cases pretty tricky, or limited archival material makes those cases pretty tricky.
All right, thanks so much, everybody. Let's give Bob a hand.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm really happy to hear from anyone by email or on Twitter if anyone wants to carry on the conversation. Thank you.